All right, we're back and live and ready to get started on today's webinar, which is on Category 4 of the organizational standards around organizational leadership. Again, you'll hear myself, Cash, and you throughout today's event, both as a host, kind of a question moderator, and I may pop in every once in a while with some content, but for the most part, you're going to be in the able hands of Jarl Crocker, our Director of TNPA. And with that, Jarl, if you're ready to take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Cashin, and thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on the Technical Assistance Guide for Category 4, continuing our series of webinars to support the Technical Assistance Guides that we are producing to help our members and other community action agencies prepare for implementation of the organizational standards. Just a quick note, this guide is almost ready to go live, but we haven't uploaded it to our web page yet, so please be sure to check back. We anticipate that it should be ready in the next couple of days, early next week at the very latest, so you'll be able to access it and download it at the usual place in on our web page. So to begin this afternoon, I want to quickly go over the agenda, and then we'll jump right into the standard since we have a fair amount of information to cover. So we'll begin with a quick overview of the Technical Assistance Guide itself, how we've structured the guide, and some basic questions that agencies may want to answer as they think about preparing the process to go through and check their compliance with the standards. And then we'll talk about the standards themselves. We will pause after each standard to take questions from the audience, and then one final time when we are complete. So again, thank you very much for joining, and we will jump right in. So to begin with a quick overview of the structure of the Technical Assistance Guide, this is the same across all guides for all categories. And we have two primary purposes that we're trying to address with these technical assistance guides. The first is obviously to help our agencies make sure that they are in compliance with the standards. And so for every standard, you will see a Section A and a Section B, which provides that background information related to compliance with the standard. So in Section A, you will find some additional background information on the definition and intent of the standard. So if there are any technical issues or issues related to activities around the standards, we go into a little bit more detail and also make sure to explain why the standard was included in the list of overall standards. We think it's important for our agencies to understand why the standards were chosen. And then in Section B, you'll find a couple of different resources. The first is a quick review of common questions that we've had from agencies about different issues that might come up in interpreting the standard. So we provide a little bit of additional guidance based on those questions that we've received from agencies to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what meets and doesn't meet the standard. And we also provide documentation in that section, or support in that Section B, on the documentation that you will likely need to show that you are in compliance with the standard. Again, our usual caveat applies that it's ultimately up to your state CSBG lead agency, your state office, to define what the standard means and what documentation you will need to show. But again, we provide our best guess at what that documentation will most likely include, just so folks can get a jump on thinking through what type of supporting materials they might need to supply when they are monitored against the standard, and to just help with that planning process. Now, the second goal of our technical assistance guides is also to help agencies go beyond compliance. So when you are going through the process of assessing your compliance with the standards, we are suggesting that agencies take a little bit of extra time, have their staff review the activity related to the standard, use the resources that are provided in Sections C and D that I'll talk about in just one second, and provide some basic recommendations to leadership and the board where it's appropriate about how the agency might improve its performance around those activities related to the standard. So you will see in Section C some brief diagnostic questions that staff can use to help think through how they might improve those activities related to the standards. And then Section D provides some additional background resources, both for looking at compliance of the standard, but also looking at best practices, case studies, guides, how-to manuals that might provide the staff a good baseline for looking at how well the agency is doing related to the activities around the standard. So we also include in the guide some basic questions that agencies might think through as they begin the process of assessing their compliance with the standards. And so we suggest a couple of basic principles that agencies might use to guide this process. So to begin, we suggest that agencies make sure that the review process for Category 4 is connected to reviews of the other standards. So we are assuming that you will probably have different staff working on that review process for different standards, so making sure that staff are on the same page about how that process will work is very important. Secondly, look for opportunities to connect the review process into ongoing agency activities. So when you're thinking through, when you're scheduling the review, pulling those documents to show you're in compliance with the standard, if there are opportunities to align those with already planned agency activities. So for example, if you know you're going to be conducting a community assessment this year, that would probably be a good time to go ahead and pull the documentation you need to show you're in compliance with that particular category, I believe Category 3. So look for ways to reduce the overall administrative burden by incorporating that process for assessing yourself against the standards in those already planned agency activities. A third suggestion is consider including a team of staff in that review process. So we know some agencies will probably just assign different categories to single staff because sometimes that's simply the most efficient way to go through that process. But we're suggesting that you actually consider having 2 or 3 staff go through that process for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a good staff capacity building exercise. It's a good way to cross-train staff on different aspects of the management and operations of the agency. And it's also helpful to have a couple of staff around the table, again, to do that brief evaluation that we're suggesting and make recommendations to the agency about how it can improve its performance. We also suggest that you make sure that all staff know how to assess compliance. So if you're using different staff across different standards, it's a good idea to make sure that all of them have read any guidance from the state office about the interpretation of the standard and related documentation, and make sure that they have that opportunity probably together in at least one group meeting to go through that basic process. We also suggest that staff use a uniform documentation process, so making sure that all staff knows how that documentation is supposed to be identified, where it is going to be stored. So if you're uploading different files to your state office, if you have a centralized system that the state office has created, making sure all staff know how that process works. If you were storing the documentation for a site visit by a monitor from the state office, making sure that everybody's on the same page about how the filing system for that works and how the documentation process works. We also suggest that agencies set up a process for incorporating those recommendations that we're suggesting that staff make. So this might potentially be a debriefing meeting once you have completed your monitoring visit, or after you've uploaded all that documentation to the state office. You might convene staff to go through the recommendations that they will make about how to improve those operations related to the different standards, just so that doesn't get lost and there's a clear follow-up process in place for acting on those recommendations. And then lastly, make sure that there is a uniform process for archiving reviews. This is obviously a process you'll have to go through in subsequent years, so making sure that there's at least a 1 or 2 page explanation of the process that staff used, any lessons learned, any notes about the documentation that was pulled, just because you will probably not have the same staff going through this process 2 or 3 or 4 years from now. So you want to make sure that there's some basic record so that process goes as smoothly as possible in those out years. And again, we're also suggesting agencies take a little bit of extra time to do that internal evaluation process, so we provide some basic guidance about how your staff might go about that. So the easiest approach would simply be to have a short discussion of the strengths and opportunities for improvement once staff has gone through and identified the documentation that they'll need to show compliance. Simply have a short discussion about how the agency has done previously related to the activities around the standard, and then solicit some recommendations about how the agency might improve its performance. Another option, a little bit more time, would be to review the resource materials that we provide in that Section D. So again, we do our best to provide things like case studies, how-to manuals, guides that describe the different processes and organizational activities. So another option would be to review some of those, potentially look at case studies from other agencies, review how-to manuals as a basic guide to see how well your agency is doing related to the activities around the standards that you're assessing compliance with, and then go ahead and make those recommendations to your agency about how it might improve its performance. A third option would be to conduct interviews and maybe a quick focus group with key staff. Again, that would be a way to expand the number of folks who are involved in that evaluation process, get some additional feedback, also make sure that your agency is fully participating in this review process, and then submit those recommendations as we suggest. And then the last option would be to conduct interviews or a quick focus group with outside partners or experts if that's appropriate. So again, we know that a lot of our agencies are pressed for time going through the process, assessing against the standards. But again, this is simply an exercise that could take, as short a time as, 30 or 45 minutes, just enough time for staff to have a thoughtful discussion about how the agency has been doing in those activities related to the standards, and then how it might improve, hopefully using the resources that we provided and those diagnostic questions also that you'll see in Section C. So before we jump into the standards themselves, any questions about how to use the technical assistance guide and the processes that I've described?
It does not look like we've had any questions that have come in yet, but there is one other item that I did want to note, that the Leadership Technical Assistance Guide, like all of the guides for all of the standards, has a Likert scale at the end of each of them. So in this case, it's a 5-point scale so that you can look at yourself in the middle, 3, satisfactory, you're meeting the standard, but also gives you that, did I miss this by a little or by a lot? And we suggest, even if you don't go through any of these other kind of beyond compliance items, that you do, in fact, take a look at that Likert scale. That way you have a benchmark as you go forward. So look for that. It will be at the back of the leadership guide, as it is through all of the guides.
Great. Thank you so much, Cashin. All right, so jumping right into Standard 4.1, the Governing Board has reviewed the organization's mission statement within the past 5 years and assured that 1, the mission addresses poverty, and 2, the organization's programs and services are in alignment with the mission. So beginning with that Section A that I talked about previously, we provide some additional background on the guidance and definition of this standard. And so obviously this is a guiding principle for all nonprofits, that your program activities are aligned with your mission. Again, your mission does not have to include the specific term poverty, but that does have to be the general objective anti-poverty work that your agency is working towards. This standard is also aligned with a 5-year requirement to conduct a strategic plan. So again, there's some alignment with the strategic planning standards. And then lastly, the standard is intended to help make sure agencies are aware of any potential risks of mission drift and that their program activities remain in alignment with their overall mission, something that it's a good idea to generally check, especially when you're doing your strategic planning process. So I think that's a good tie-in with some of the other standards. Now, in terms of Section B, the guidance on compliance and documentation, 2 questions that have come up related to this standard. The first is if the review of the mission is in process at the time when the agency is assessed against the standard. So maybe the board is still in the process of reviewing the agency's mission. in that particular case, we are assuming that most states would give you credit for this process and that the agency would simply have to check in with their state office once that process was completed. But otherwise, if you are in process, you should be counted as being in compliance with the standard. And then secondly, a case where the board has reviewed the mission, but it has not addressed alignment with programs and services. So simply having the board review your mission is not enough. They have to have that further discussion to make sure your programs and services are in alignment with that mission. So important that you are meeting both parts of this particular standard. So in terms of guidance for the documentation, we are assuming most state offices will request. You need documentation related to all three requirements, that the review was conducted within the past 5 years, that your mission addresses poverty, and that the board has reviewed that programs and services are in alignment with the mission. So 3 things that you would probably have to show documentation for to meet this particular standard. And that documentation could include minutes from a board retreat or meeting showing that they had gone through this process, a strategic plan that includes the mission statement, the process of review and other comments, and or a mission statement with a board review date noted. I think would also be acceptable, but simply have a quick summary to explain how you've gone through the process and met the standard, and then provide that supporting documentation such as board minutes to formally show that it has been completed. So Section C, some quick diagnostic questions for beyond compliance that we would suggest agencies think through, and again, make those recommendations on how they could improve around this particular standard. So one question, does your agency have written policies and procedures in place to structure your mission review process? So making sure that the board, at least on probably an annual basis would be our suggestion, does a review of the mission and making sure that those programs are in alignment with the mission. So probably every 3 years would be sufficient. Certainly every 5 years would meet the standard. But again, doing this as an annual exercise is just a good way to make sure that the mission is included on a regular basis in discussion of the overall agency activity and make sure there hasn't been any mission drift. Another diagnostic question to ask is your mission infused into all aspects of agency operations? So again, a quick review, is your mission prominently displayed? Is it on the back of your business card? Is it used as a guide when you're talking about funding for additional programs or developing resources? Is it being used as a guide to make sure your mission guides the overall activities of your agency? And then lastly, is your mission a factor in the decision-making process in your organization? So making sure, again, that the mission statement isn't just something that sits in a binder, but it's actively used to guide especially strategic decisions that the agency makes about what program it provides, about how its resources are allocated, and general planning for the future. And then again, we provide you with some additional resources in that Section D. So a good resource here is Module 2 in the ROMA curriculum that covers the agency's mission, and an article about how to create an effective nonprofit mission statement. So again, we're trying to provide just the best resources out there, so these aren't extensive lists, just making sure that folks can really hone in on the resources that are absolutely necessary to help them both assess compliance with the standard and do that quick evaluation that we're suggesting. All right, it looks like we have one question that's come in. During the period that a agency is in the process of creating a mission statement, are they in compliance with 4.1? Again, our assumption is that as long as you are in the process of creating that mission statement, if you're recreating the mission statement or creating a new mission statement, you should be assessed as being in compliance if you are monitored during that period when your mission is still under development. We would assume in most cases that a state office would put you down as in compliance, and then would either have an MOU or a simple simple check-in with the agency to confirm when that process has been completed. So again, this is something to check with your state office if you know that you're going to be monitored when you think you are going through one of the processes around either this standard or other ones. Again, just to make sure that you are on the same page with the state office and there's a system in place for these in-process kinds of activities where you're monitored while something is going on, whether it's this standard, a strategic planning process, your needs assessment, just to confirm with your state office that you can simply check in with them when the process is completed and then formally be assessed as being in compliance with the standard.
Thanks. The one thing I did want to add in there is it looked like that was particularly a public agency. So I understand that there is actually very little difference in the standards between the private and the public, though of course this webinar series is focused on the private ones. But I understand that it is going to be a bigger lift for those public agencies. The private agencies probably already have that mission statement in place. It's just making sure that they have the documentation to be able to show the review and or the dates of that, whereas not all public agencies actually already have that. So they're kind of starting a little bit behind the line in that sense if you have to both create the mission statement and be able to show that review process. So I would think that that first round or two, the state offices are probably going to have some leeway if they are working with public agencies.
Great, thanks, Cashin. And in that particular case, the resources that are up on the screen might be especially helpful in thinking through that process to develop that mission statement.
All right, it looks like there's a bit of a follow-on to that. Can the mission statement be the mission from the Community Action Board and not the entire public CAP? So again, if you're looking at just the public CAP side of it instead of the private, there's no question it is for your entire agency, end of discussion there. But when it does come to that public CAP, I usually think about it as what does that Community Action Board actually cover? So if you only have a handful of the programs, that's what your mission statement is going to be based on. What are your true community action activities that flow through that board?
Right, and again, if you are a public agency, you obviously can't create a mission statement for your agency in its entirety. Hopefully your public agency already has a mission statement that guides its work, but again, as the question clarifies and as Cashin explained, your mission statement would just be for the activities covered by or related to your CSBG funding.
Great, all right, that is all I see for now, but keep the questions coming and we'll move on into the next one.
Great, so Standard 4.2, the organization's Community Action Plan is outcome-based, anti-poverty focused, and ties directly to the community assessment. So starting out with guidance on the definition and intent of the standard. So according to the CSBG Act, an assurance that the state will secure from each eligible entity in the state as a condition to receipt of funding by the entity through a community services block grant made under this chapter for the program, a community action plan that includes a community needs assessment for the community served, will be provided. So typically agencies fill out the template for their community action plan, submit it to the state office, but again, that's required by the CSBG Act. Again, the standard has three elements, that your community action plan is outcome focused, that it is anti-poverty focused, and it is tied to the community assessment. So a little bit more complexity with this particular standard. And again, the state typically defines that template. So our suggestion is that you go ahead and take a look at the template you typically use. Make sure that it is clear from that template that you would be meeting the standard if you filled it out. And if not, that's a good follow-up question for your state office to address any issues that might arise if it is unclear, at least according to the template you typically use for your community action plan, that you would meet all three parts of the standard. And if not, again, this is a good standard to think about how you would write a quick paragraph or explanation of how your community action plan addresses those three requirements. So guidance on compliance and documentation. So again, the first challenge that might arise is if that state format, the template used by your state office, does not easily identify those three elements. Again, that would simply be a case where you would probably want to provide a clarifying quick paragraph to explain how your community action plan addresses those three elements if it's not already clear in the template that you typically use. Another issue would be the agency's community action plan only addresses one or two of the three requirements. So note that this is not one of those standards that includes an and or, which means that you have to address all three of those requirements. And then lastly, we anticipate there might be some challenges developing a common understanding of outcomes-based. So obviously, you don't want to just focus on the outputs of your programs. You also want to focus on the outcomes. So making sure that your state office has clarified how they are defining outcomes, so then you can respond to that when you're showing that you're in compliance with the standard. So a number of standards, but I think this one in particular shows that it's a good idea to go ahead and reach out to your state office if there are any questions around the guidance they provided or any other issues around the clarity with which they are interpreting these kinds of standards. Because words like outcome can mean different things to different people, so making sure you're on the same page with the state office, not waiting until you have that monitoring visit, I think would be a good thing to do in this particular case. So turning to the documentation that you might use. So again, that documentation would have to show all three elements, and this could simply include your community action plan, a subsequent logic model, again, that would address the kind of outcomes that you're trying to produce, and your community assessment showing those linkages, and again, probably a good standard to use a quick explanation. Don't leave it to the monitor to interpret. You would just simply want to describe how your community action plan meets all these three requirements. So moving on to those quick diagnostic questions that you can use to assess how well you're doing with your community action plan. So one is to ask, is the process to create the community action plan tightly connected to the community assessment and strategic plan? So again, your community assessment should be what informs the development of both your strategic plan and your community action plan. So when you're assessing how well your agency is doing with the standard, you want to make sure that your community assessment is clearly reflected in those activities described in your community action plan, and that your community action plan is tied to your strategic plan. A second question to ask is, are staff from different parts of the agency engaged in the development of the community action plan? Again, this is a good opportunity to pull in those other staff, but also since your staff is probably going to be widely responsible for actually implementing the community action plan, it's a good idea to make sure that they are part of the process in developing that community action plan. So making sure that everybody is on the same page from the beginning, that it isn't something that's just done by a small committee and then your program staff has to live with the results. It's a good idea to make sure that you have some broad participation of folks like your program managers as you're developing that community action plan. And then resources for this particular standard would be to reference IM 49, and again, any state template or guideline. So making sure the staff that are doing the assessment for this particular standard are familiar with the template that you use for your community action plan would probably be important from the beginning.
All right. Does not look like we have any questions that have come in thus far. So I think we'll go ahead and make a jump into 4.3, but don't make this the last time you come in contact with us.
Great. So standard 4.3, this is everyone's favorite. The organization's community action plan and strategic plan document the continuous use of the full results-oriented management and accountability cycle or comparable system, assessment planning, implementation, achievement of results, and evaluation. In addition, the organization documents having used the services of a ROMA certified trainer or equivalent to assist in implementation. So again, opening guidance around the definition and intent of the standard, and this is one that we've had a fair amount of questions about, and that's why we include this first section A, again, to answer some of those questions, make sure that our agencies get the full background, any technical issues related to this standard, and generally have hopefully some of those questions answered by this background information. So again, the standard is included because implementation of the full ROMA cycle, including consultation with a certified ROMA trainer, is a generally advised activity, making sure you are implementing the ROMA cycle. Again, IM 49 talks about with ROMA how we answer the questions, why are we here, who are we helping, what are we helping them to become, and how will we know and describe success, both theirs and ours. So this standard is important to making sure that agencies continue to apply the ROMA standard to their strategic planning and community action plan, but also to the full set of activities, programs, and other services that you provide to your customers. And then lastly, ROMA and the general ROMA framework is about how we as community action agencies do business. You don't need a certified ROMA trainer on staff to meet this standard, so just that's a common question, so making sure that's clear. But you do need to engage the services of a ROMA trainer. So if you don't have a ROMA trainer on staff, making sure that you know who you are going to reach out to, so working with your state association if you don't know who could potentially provide you that service, and also the ROMA web page has a list of all certified ROMA trainers, so that would be another way to get in touch with folks to help you comply with this standard. So turning to Section B on guidance on compliance and documentation, again, a common question or challenge might be making sure that all elements of the ROMA cycle, assessment, planning, implementation, achievement of results, and evaluation are complete at the time of the review. So again, this is a standard where you're probably going to have to provide some additional background to explain how you've incorporated all those different elements. But again, you would have to have all 5 of those elements of the ROMA cycle included and be able to illustrate this. So we have a quick question that has come in. In 4.3, does the trainer have to be on site to review the program planning and provide training, or can this be done online? Again, this is something to clarify with your state office, but in the partnership's interpretation of the standard, we think it would be perfectly acceptable to simply have a certified ROMA trainer review your community action plan and strategic plan. You would not have to have a trainer on site or with you for the full process of developing either your strategic plan or community action plan. As long as a trainer has reviewed the results, provided you with technical assistance during both of those plans' development, you should be able to to be in compliance with this particular standard.
All right, well, since we're taking questions, might as well go ahead, and there's actually been a few that have come in. Does attending ROMA workshops at conferences qualify as using the services of a ROMA certified trainer for 4.3? And I would say in that particular case, no, because we are looking more at the ROMA trainers in a more consultative role. It's not just about the kind of standard training, it's about digging in and actually looking at the implementation of how these are going to work out. So I would say that no, a ROMA workshop probably would not count, but do keep up with it because it may count in Category 7 on human resources, where we tell you that you have to specifically do training for your staff and call out ROMA. So do count it, but not for 4.3. Two examples of what that might look like would be if you have a ROMA trainer potentially facilitate part of the planning process used to develop your community action plan or your strategic plan, that would certainly be participation of a ROMA trainer. Also, if you have a ROMA trainer review the draft of your community action plan and strategic plan, obviously I would suggest that you have them look for those 5 elements of the ROMA cycle to provide feedback, and then any communication through the follow-up process that the ROMA trainer would provide would then become a good documentation to show that you are in compliance with the standard.
We also have a question, what are examples of an equivalent trainer? So in some states, there are processes similar to ROMA that are used by the state. So if your state had a similar process, so some states, for example, use results-based management and accountability, or RBA, as a framework, very similar to ROMA. So if your state used RBA, in that case you would simply use the services of a certified RBA trainer. So again, that's a question that's more up to whatever framework your state uses, although we think most do use ROMA.
Sure, and just to add on to that and to kind of pick up another question that asks what does equivalent mean and to whom does it apply, the official guidance does allow that a state can choose an alternate system. So honestly, we have never heard of a state that has designated one. So it's purposely given that leeway in case a state decides to use that flexibility, but at this point in time, the equivalent or comparable system does not actually apply to anyone that we know of at this point in time. So no one that we know of has decided to use that alternate system.
Great, and we'll certainly provide you any update if that changes, but good clarification. So at least at this point in time, that would mean a ROMA certified trainer.
Sure, and another question that has come in, would the state program officer that reviews the plans provide feedback and is ROMA certified be enough? I would think that as long as it really is a conversation, you're kind of providing that feedback, you could probably actually count that. Now, if it's just, I turned it in, they checked off and said, yes, all of the items are here, and that was the end of the story, then I would say no. But as long as it really is a two-way street to really work through it, think through, get that feedback, then I would think you could count that. All right.
Right, so on to guidance on the documentation that you might use. So again, the documentation must include both parts, the use of the full, the inclusion of the full ROMA cycle and that consultation with a certified ROMA trainer. And so that documentation could include a documentation tool or other narrative speaking to the full ROMA cycle and the involvement of a certified ROMA trainer. So you would need to be able, in that documentation, to indicate all 5 stages of the ROMA cycle. So again, this is a good standard to consider, having a quick, clarifying paragraph or 2 where you can point to the different elements of that cycle. You would also need either an agreement with a ROMA trainer to document their participation and or meeting summaries with the trainer, preferably the feedback that they provide to you. So again, in addition to those questions about the role of the ROMA trainer, I think potentially the more complicated part of this particular standard is being able to illustrate all 5 stages of that ROMA process are included, again, in your community action plan and strategic plan. So additional diagnostic questions for agencies that want to go beyond compliance. The first question, does your agency have a ROMA trainer on staff and encourage staff to become ROMA trainers? So again, good example of going beyond compliance, making sure you have staff capacity related to ROMA. So if you don't have a ROMA trainer on staff, I think this particular standard is a good impetus to making sure your agency does have a ROMA trainer on staff, and also making sure that training is available to different staff. I think the more that we incorporate the ROMA framework across all of our program activities, probably the better off our agencies are. And so that is certainly one thing to consider as you think about your professional development resources. And then secondly, are ROMA principles applied at the program and the frontline levels of the agency? So one thing we hear from folks who have gone through ROMA training is that they go through training, maybe they get consulted every once in a while about a particular program, but the ROMA framework isn't fully integrated across the agency. So again, a great diagnostic question to ask is, how does your agency implement that ROMA framework? How is it actually applied when it comes to looking at how your programs and services are planned, how you collect those results, how you look at those outcomes, and then how you change the programs based on the data that you collect? So again, a great example of a standard where the standard itself is really only the tip of the iceberg. The real questions that our agency should be asking is, how are we fully incorporating ROMA into our work? And then we provide some basic resources. Again, IM49, helpful background document. Also improving performance, scoring success, using balanced scorecards for organizational excellence. So the partnership has a guide on developing an organizational scorecard, which is, we think, a crucially important tool for making sure that agencies are tracking outcomes, not just with your programs, but also with things like customer service, other aspects of the agency's management and operations. And then that balanced scorecard is used to make sure that the agency is routinely assessing its performance, looking at ways to improve its outcomes, and again, good example of fully incorporating the ROMA cycle into the work of an agency. And then another link to using strengths-based approach to implementing ROMA throughout the Community Action Agency, another guide available on our website talking about how you fully implement ROMA. So some great resources to consider, and again, very helpful in making those recommendations about how an agency can incorporate ROMA going beyond compliance. We also have a couple of worksheets available on our website about how to potentially document the use of that ROMA trainer, and so that's what's on your screen right now. I believe we're updating some of these resources, so we're trying to continue to improve them based on your feedback and, as you'll notice, in compliance with ROMA principles. So you can download those sheets from our website. Again, we think that this is a good way to document compliance with this particular standard, but again, appreciate any other feedback that you might have on tools like this that will help document your compliance with the standards.
Great, and one thing to note, this is actually hopefully going to be published along with the guide next week, because it did actually recently go through some additional resources to be added to it. We worked with Barbara Mooney to make sure that this was the best possible. So it is not technically up there today, but will be within the next few days when we put up this guide. So we did have a question that came in a few minutes ago that was talking about how they kind of start their whole ROMA process with a community needs assessment, and then at the end come up with that community action plan, and they submit all of that to their state. The process has all of these elements and recommendations, so do they need to do another process? And the answer to that is no. This is simply documenting that process. We know that you're doing your planning. We know that you're doing your needs assessment. We know you are going to be revisiting all of those into a cycle. So this is simply documenting the cycle that you are already going through. You don't have to do any additional work except for figuring out how to actually document the pieces, unless somehow you have managed to skip a level in the cycle or something along those lines, which I highly, highly doubt, but for the most part it is just about being able to describe and put your hands on how you actually did it. And that's what those little tables that we have up on the screen now are meant to do. It's not any kind of rocket science to it. It's literally narrative about here's all the different elements, here's what we did, here's the trainer we talked to, they were on staff, they were at the state, they were under a contract, whatever it is, and exactly when and what they did. So again, not rocket science and not above and beyond the overall process that you already do. Let's see. A smaller agency asked whether the review process could count. So I think we actually did get that already answered. Yes, if a state, if you did have your monitor or your state program director that was ROMA certified and you were working in that more consultative kind of role, then yes, I think that would work, and that's an excellent resource because we know that not all the ROMA trainers are evenly distributed around the country. There are some states that only have a few that are on staff, so make sure that if those are at the state office or state association level, which many state offices and state associations have certified ROMA trainers, that you really are taking advantage of those. All right, that's all I see for 4.3, so we can go ahead and make the jump to 4.4.
Great, so moving on for 4.4, the Governing Board receives an annual update on the success of specific strategies included in the Community Action Plan. So turning to, again, that basic background that we provide. Again, important to note that this is something that's required by the CSBG Act. It's also clarified in IM49 that the entity and its board complete regular assessments of the entity's overall mission, desired impacts, and program structure. So, again, some additional guidance through that IM. Also, the CSBG Act explains that tripartite boards must fully participate in the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of the program to serve low-income communities. So again, the standard is about making sure that we meet those requirements within the CSBG Act and conform to the guidance in IM49. And then also IM82 clarifies that boards should request and be provided with information concerning actual changes or improvements that have occurred among clients and the community as a result of agency assistance. So again, that IM clarifies the role of the board in looking at the actual outcomes that should be tracked based on the Community Action Plan. So again, this particular section provides that basic background explaining how this particular standard is connected both to the Act and to the guidance in a couple of different IMs, and especially explains the important role that the board plays when it comes to looking at the outcomes that you talk about trying to achieve through your Community Action Plan. So two potential questions that might come up in terms of interpreting compliance with the standard. The first is what qualifies as updated. So again, if you potentially just provide your board with a link to outcomes related to your Community Action Plan, that might potentially not qualify as meeting the standard. Again, the intent of the standard is for your board to really review those outcomes, have a discussion about them. So our understanding is this, interpreting the standard really means that your board has a chance to discuss those outcomes. There is a presentation about them. The board really has a chance to have a discussion about any issues that have come up. So again, just simply providing a link to a document might not be interpreted as meeting the standard. And again, the other question of what happens if that update is in process. So you're gathering the data to present to the board but haven't presented it yet. So again, in that particular instance, we are assuming an agency would simply confirm with the state office that that update has taken place, but should otherwise be put down as meeting the standard as long as that process is reasonably underway at the time that they are monitored. Documentation for the standard could include board minutes showing that, with the date showing that that update was given to the board, board packets with any reports or materials given out, or the time on the agenda for the updates, and again, a report or an update document. All those would be acceptable. In terms of those diagnostic questions for going beyond compliance, the first is, does your agency have written policies and procedures in place for the Community Action Plan? So again, just like a strategic plan, your Community Action Plan should be a living document. So how does your agency routinely incorporate a review of the Community Action Plan? In the same way you should be reporting on its results to the board, the agency should be routinely reviewing the outcomes associated with that plan, and again, using it as a living document to guide programs and service delivery strategies. Another question to ask is, does your agency have a process to review the Community Action Plan more frequently at the board level? So again, the standard only requires an annual update. we think it's probably good procedure to update the board, potentially on a quarterly basis. Again, you want to give the board an opportunity to be thoughtful about the outcome data that you're talking about, looking at any changes in programs and services. So again, waiting until the end of the year reduces the amount of feedback that the board can give the agency, reduces their ability to address any issues that might have come up with a program or a service delivery strategy. So again, consider actually having that occur on a more frequent than an annual basis. And then lastly, are your community assessment, community action plan, and strategic plan clearly connected? So again, reviewing to making sure that all three of those core processes are tightly connected together, and that your community assessment clearly flows into the development of both your strategic plan and your community action plan. And again, we provide some additional resources, that guidance mentioned in Section A from IM 49 and IM 82, providing you that additional background, clarifying why the standard was included. So any questions before we move on to 4.5?
All right, we'll give people a moment to type in any late breaking that have to do with 4.4. And I think an opportunity just to remind everybody to think about 4.2 and 4.3 together. I don't know why we couldn't put them sequentially. We wanted to make sure that ROMA process was stuck in the middle there. But actually, I think that's fitting in a way, because you should be thinking about that development of the community action plan, making sure that it does have those elements, the outcome-based, the anti-poverty focus, tying to the assessment. But then to complete that kind of ROMA process, you would be coming back to revisit it and evaluating yourself against that plan to know whether you were successful or not. So again, make sure that you are thinking about these standards holistically instead of trying to make it a checklist and going one right after the other. So with that, I did not see any questions come in during my little ramblings there, so we'll go ahead to 4.5.
Great. So for standard 4.5, the organization has a written succession plan in place for the CEO or ED approved by the governing board, which contains procedures for covering an emergency/unplanned short-term absence of 3 months or less, as well as outlines the process for filling a permanent vacancy. So to clarify, one frequently asked question is that standard asking for 3 things or 2? The answer is asking for 2 things. So your succession plan needs to cover an emergency or unplanned short-term absence of 3 months or less, and the process for filling a permanent vacancy. Some people ask whether it was an emergency or unplanned vacancy, then secondly, a short-term absence of 3 months or less, and then filling that permanent vacancy. There are only 2 things that this standard is asking you to provide in that particular case.
Yes, a very important comma. I guess we're like the ACA there.
Yes. So again, background on the definition and intent of the standard. So it covers 4 different things: the CEO-ED position, the approval by the governing board, that unplanned short absence, and then that process for filling a permanent vacancy. So again, one of the more complex standards because there are several moving parts that it refers to. This is also a key element of a risk management strategy, so having that succession plan, a couple of different succession plans in place for those short-term and permanent absences is an important part of being able to manage risks. Typically, your succession plan would name an interim leader in that case of the 3-month or less absence. Typically names the location of critical organizational documents. There's usually a communication plan for announcing the replacement, and also important contacts. Also, typically a policy does not name individuals, but articulates the process for the board to follow to fill a vacancy at the CEO-ED position. So again, typically for that shorter term absence, there would usually be a name or 2 associated with that. It's important there be continuity in the case of that unplanned absence, but for that longer term or to fill a permanent vacancy, you typically do not name a replacement person. But again, a helpful background explaining why it's important to have a succession plan in place. So guidance on compliance and documentation. A couple questions that may come up. If the agency only has some of the elements of a succession plan in place, so let's say you have a succession plan for filling a permanent vacancy in the CEO or ED position, but you don't have that succession plan for what happens with that short-term vacancy, you would not be in compliance. So the agency, again, needs to have met all of the elements laid out in this particular standard. Another example would be a situation where the board has not approved the succession plan. So you have one for both that short-term and permanent vacancy, but the board has not officially approved it. Again, simply having the board look at that plan, while a good idea would not fulfill the standard, you need to have a formal board approval of those two types of succession plans that are required by the standard. And then documentation might include, again, all elements that we've talked about. So this would include a succession plan and policy for both of those instances, the short-term absence and the longer absence, and also board minutes showing approval for a formal mechanism such as a vote or resolution. So again, evidence that the board has formally approved both of the types of succession plans that this standard requires. So guidance for going beyond compliance, questions agencies can ask. So first of all, has your succession plan been reviewed or refreshed recently? So we know sometimes this is something, since it's not necessarily a commonly used document, that agencies sort of have lying around on the shelf. So just making sure it's been updated, especially in those cases of short-term absences, we think is important. Also asking, has the agency communicated the key tenets of the succession plan? So do people know, so not just do you have that document, do people know what would happen if you actually had to implement it, again, to ensure that continuity of both leadership and services. Another question to ask, are other key positions in your agency also covered by succession plans? So again, this standard only applies to the CEO or ED, but there are other key positions that you might want to have similar plans in place. So the head of your finance department, your comptroller, or CFO, your CAO would be another, or COO would be other types of positions that you might want to have a succession plan to cover. And then lastly is succession planning built into a conscious leadership development process. So does your agency have a plan in place to develop its leadership bench to potentially replace those leadership positions internally? Is the succession planning process something that is actually discussed? Is there an overall plan in place for leadership development within your organization? All important questions to ask related to that succession planning document. And then in terms of resources, what you see up on the screen, a couple of different documents available from the partnership that describes both the development of a succession plan. So several of these guides have templates for succession plans that you can adapt to use to meet this standard, and also some guides about developing your leadership bench, so helping your agency develop those strategies to build internal leadership capacity, and also address the spirit of the standard, making sure that the agency has an overall plan for thinking about continuity of leadership as time moves forward and leaders need to be replaced. So questions about Standard 4.5 before we move on?
Doesn't look like there have been any that have come in. Just to put a small reminder in here, again, we don't recommend any particular types of resources over any other, and there really is not one single model for succession plans and policies. However, if this is one that you have a feeling that you might be struggling with, I would point you to that Preparing for Your Community Action Agency Future, that Part 2. It does kind of give you that quick and dirty version. It has that template that you can, for the most part, kind of pick up, bring to your board meeting, start trying to kind of fill in the blanks a little bit. Now, that's not the end-all, be-all of succession. Hopefully this will be an ongoing conversation especially at that board level. But if you're a little bit kind of behind on this particular standard, that would be a quick way to make sure that you reach all of those parts in year one here.
Great. And so turning to the last standard we'll look at today, 4.6, an organization-wide comprehensive risk assessment has been completed within the past 2 years and reported to the governing board. So to begin with, again, background on the standard itself, risk management is how we deal with uncertainty, and that involves identifying and assessing potential risks. So again, good management practice by an agency to conduct that risk assessment process. Also, IM 112 specifically requires a certification of a risk assessment for receipt of ARRA funds. So again, obviously ARRA funds are something in the past, but that process is still an important one to make sure that we continue as agencies. And then lastly, CSBG is an agency-wide perspective, so standard 4.3 requires an organization-wide and comprehensive risk assessment. So again, the intent of the standard is to make sure that risk assessment covers all pertinent aspects of an agency's management and operations. So turning to guidance on compliance and documentation, a couple questions that may come up. If the risk assessment or timing of the report to the board is in process at the time of assessment. So again, if you have not completed your risk assessment, we suggest that you do. But if you are in process of completing that risk assessment when you are monitored against the standards, again, this is an example of a standard where we are assuming the state office would note that you are in compliance, but wait for you to follow up as an agency to confirm that process was completed. Another question would be a situation where the agency conducted a risk assessment for some, but not all areas of management and operations. So if you just did a risk assessment on your finance operations or your HR, that would not be in compliance with this particular standard. Again, it requires you to do a comprehensive and agency-wide process. Again, the risk assessment toolkit or online tool that the partnership provides is probably the easiest way to comply with the standard. But again, if you use another tool, either an outside consultant or a similar online tool, you need to make sure that it is truly a comprehensive tool. Also, another question might be if your risk assessment is a collection of assessments and not a singular process. So if for some reason you did multiple risk assessment processes across different aspects of your agency's operations, the intent of the standard is that you do a single integrated risk assessment process. Again, the problem might be if you do separate processes, things might fall between the cracks. It might not be a truly comprehensive process. And then lastly, a question might come up where the risk assessment was made available but not reported to the board. So again, in the standards that include reporting requirements to the board, making sure that you have, in the case of the risk assessment, presented the results to the board, not simply provided them with a link to the report. Again, it's important that the board actually be able to consider the results of the risk assessment process in addition to those other standards with board reporting requirements. So making sure there's an opportunity for the board to fully discuss and analyze and take in the results of the risk assessment is both the intent of the standard, but also good practice for the agency to make sure that they comply with. So documentation for this standard must demonstrate at least 2 items: that the assessment was conducted within the prescribed time frame, so that 2-year time frame, and that it was reported to the governing board. So documentation could include a report from the risk assessment, policies and procedures for risk assessment, or listing of the elements of the risk assessment. Again, documentation, if you use our online risk assessment, you could either simply provide the full risk assessment, although if you did not want to share everything with your monitor that was in that risk assessment, you could simply show that you had gone through that process. And then secondly, board meeting minutes showing the date and that the risk assessment was discussed. So again, making sure that it's clear in those minutes that the board has had the opportunity to actually review the results of the risk assessment. Again, also important clarification, Even though we suggest, obviously, it's good practice to act on the results of the risk assessment, the standard doesn't require you to address any of the issues that have come up in the risk assessment. So simply completing it would comply with the standard, although obviously that is an instance that we would strongly suggest if you have gone through our online risk assessment that we provide, that if any issues are flagged, they are followed up appropriately by leadership and the board where appropriate. So a couple quick questions. Should the entire 94-page report be shared with the board or just the key elements that were found as risks? I think in that particular case, so again, if you haven't done the online risk assessment, it does provide you with a fairly lengthy document. I would think in that particular case, the board probably would not read through the whole 94-page report. You would just want to flag any particular issues that were identified during the risk assessment for the board's discussion.
All right, I think that gets it for now. We'll pause again in a moment for more questions.
Sure, and then to go turn to the beyond compliance question, a couple key diagnostic questions to ask. Does the agency have written policies and procedures for conducting the risk assessment? Are there any policies in place governing the use of the risk assessment? Any follow-up? Another question to ask. Does your agency have a committee with responsibility for the risk assessment? You might have a risk committee, for example, that reviews various issues on a more regular basis, since obviously there are management and operation activities within an agency that do carry risk with them, and you would probably want to make sure that you are monitoring those on a fairly regular basis and not just waiting for that 2-year cycle to turn over to conduct another risk assessment. And then lastly, does your agency have an overall risk management plan? So in addition to perhaps a risk assessment committee or similar body, is there a written document related to how the agency handles those aspects of its management and operations that carry risks with them? And then lastly, some additional resources. So I've mentioned that online tool that the partnership provides free of charge. We've also conducted 2 webinars that are archived on our webpage that go through the process for preparing to use that risk assessment tool. And then a second webinar that talks about how you might want to follow up on different findings from that risk assessment process. We would suggest if you haven't gone through that risk assessment process, you listen to both of those webinars beforehand because they provide some important information, some background and suggestions for how to go through that process. So they cover who should probably participate in that risk assessment process, documents that you would want to have on hand to complete that process as efficiently as possible, and it also just provides you an overview of the types of questions that will be asked. So again, agencies can go through that process as efficiently as possible. So any questions about the risk assessment standard?
We'll give people a moment in case there are any last-second thoughts on risk assessment. Again, same as the last time, we don't officially recommend any particular tool as the Organizational Standards Center of Excellence, but I will say that my risk assessment that the partnership does with the Nonprofit Risk Management Center was well known by both staff and the CSBG working group, so it was in mind in a sense when we were thinking about what that comprehensive agency-wide look really does. It does take quite a decent amount of time, especially if you have not gone through like those webinars point out about what kind of information you'll want to have at your fingertips. So it is an investment of time, but that does fit what we were thinking of in terms of being comprehensive. I think you can, in a sense, cobble together a risk assessment. However, I think it would be more difficult to be able to show that comprehensive nature. So I wouldn't say that it's prohibited. It doesn't necessarily have to be that one single risk assessment process, but it is a heck of a lot easier to try to basically prove that you, in fact, are touching all the relevant aspects of your operation. All right, then. And one other piece that I wanted to do, if you were going that route where you were kind of putting together your own set of risk assessment, a place that you may want to look, check with people like your insurance carriers or facilities managers and that kind of thing, because a lot of times they will have checklists or risk assessments that you can do. Again, those are usually pretty widely available. The trick is making sure that once you get them all put together, the sum of them do actually equal comprehensive and agency-wide.
Great, and do we have any questions?
That one looks like a thank you for answering our question previously. So with that, we can start into that kind of overall wrap-up.
Excellent. So what you see up on your screen is contact information for myself and all the other staff here in our training and technical assistance team. So please, if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. And again, we anticipate that the technical assistance guide will go up in the next couple of days for this particular category. So again, check back regularly, and it should be up shortly. And if you have any other questions or suggestions for us about our guides or ways that we can help you use the guides, again, feel free to contact us directly either through email or just picking up the phone and giving us a call. So thank all of you again for joining us this afternoon, and please, as always, let us know if there's anything else we can do to help support the work of your agency here at the partnership.